Good. Okay. A little bit later, at the end, Matt will be talking. I think it's a continuation of a series of sermons on Ruth. And he will be covering, I think, Ruth chapter 3. And I'm going to read now Ruth chapter 3, verses 6 to 18. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today."
Hi again, everyone. Excuse me, let me reiterate the welcome to our Sunday morning service. Great to have you with us this morning. As you've already heard, this morning I'll be undertaking part 3 of our 4-part series on the little book of Ruth. So we've been tackling a chapter at a time, so hence I'm doing chapter 3 this morning. If you're looking for a recap or you need to re-familiarise yourself with the story and what I've covered, please just jump onto YouTube and on our channel and check out parts 1 and 2, which were undertaken by Kate and Tim respectively. Now, this morning we'll be working our way through the 18 verses that make up chapter 3. And this is probably the most famous or perhaps infamous bit of the story. Or at least, if you're only going to remember one bit of the story of Ruth, it's probably going to be this little episode here. This is the episode that includes that famous nocturnal encounter between Boaz and Ruth. And what exactly went on there? There seems to be no definitive answers, but I'm hoping to shed at least a little bit of light on that this morning. But of course, we don't want that part to overshadow the larger point of both this chapter and the rest of the whole story. So if nothing else, I'd like you to remember and take away this one thing from Ruth chapter 3. God still works in the most dire and unlikely circumstances. And God still works with the most dire and unlikely means, by the most dire and unlikely means. In structuring this talk, I've followed Kate's example from back in chapter 1 and broken it into 3 scenes, if you like. So here are the 3 scenes that we'll be covering. First of all, the plotting of a bold plan. Secondly, the execution of that bold plan. And number 3, and this the third part will be the briefest, the initial results of that bold plan. So let's kick off with that plan. Just by means of a brief refresher, in terms of the cast. So the cast, we've got Naomi. So Naomi is a Jewish mother-in-law of Ruth and also a widow. So Naomi has lost a husband and she's lost her 2 sons. So that's Naomi, Jewish mother-in-law and widow. And then we've got Ruth. So Ruth is Naomi's daughter-in-law, a Moabitess, so not Jewish. And so she's lost her husband, one of Naomi's sons. And then we've got Boaz, who I think would have been introduced via chapter 2, which is the last talk in this series. So from chapter 2, Boaz and Ruth have met. Boaz is a relative of Naomi's on her deceased husband's side, and that's important to note. So Boaz is related to Naomi on her side, on her husband's side, not to Ruth. He's a man of means. He owns land, and he's growing crops on that land, courtesy of his many staff. He's an older guy. And in chapter 2, you may recall, he's become aware of Ruth and Naomi's situation. And he actually praises Ruth for her faithfulness to Naomi. Thanks, Dave, that's great. So he praises Ruth due to her faithfulness to Naomi in choosing to leave her people, her land, and follow Naomi back to her homeland. Now Naomi, in turn, she's heard of Boaz's generosity and consideration towards Ruth and is suitably impressed with Boaz as well. And Naomi has also made the connection that he is a relative and kinsman redeemer. Kinsman redeemer. What is one of those? So you may recall from your Old Testament that there were laws in place. So part of the Levitical law that we read about in Leviticus and maybe Deuteronomy, where if there was a husband and a wife, and the husband died in battle or some other early death before they had children, it was a brother-in-law's duty. If there are any brother-in-laws, it was as in a brother of the deceased husband. It was their duty to marry the widow in order to try to keep on bearing that line, if that makes sense. So that was kind of written in the Levitical law. A kinsman redeemer arrangement is different. So this was more of a, if you like, an obligation, perhaps, more so than a specified in detailed law. So this custom involved a circle of close relatives beyond the brother-in-law, and it was concerned with more than just ensuring that the bloodlines didn't cease. There are only a few texts in the Old Testament that hint at what was involved specifically, and many of them are here in Ruth. But Leviticus 25 gives us some ideas as to what it involved. So it probably involved buying back or redeeming property. It would have involved settling any debts on behalf of the family, and maybe even saving some relatives from slavery or servanthood. So again, buying servants or slaves back. So it was concerned with, if you like, the larger network of a family and its financial concerns as well, not just bloodlines. And these kinsman redeemers were plural. But that group of potential kinsman redeemers, that would have been based on some continuum as well. And we see that here. So Boaz, as we read, was a kinsman redeemer. But according to the existing custom, he wasn't the first in line. And so he had to defer to the guy in chapter 4 that we'll get to next time, who was the first in line. So that's what we know about kinsman redeemers. And that's some background to chapter 3. So fast forward a couple of weeks from chapter 2, the barley has been harvested and is now being winnowed. And in these first 5 verses, which hopefully you've got in front of you, Naomi, the mother-in-law, does almost all the talking. She's the initiator of this entire plan. And she puts it forward in quite daring terms. So look at verse 1. She states the issue via a rhetorical question. My daughter, should I not seek rest for you? And right off the bat, the text is pointing out a couple of things. First, that term, daughter, is one of great affection and tenderness. So we're being reminded here that there is a great love between this Jewish woman and her Moabite daughter-in-law. Secondly, that word, rest, at least that's how it reads in the ESV translation, and I think it's translated home in the NIV, if you've got that in front of you. Its root word in Hebrew speaks to security, to tranquility, and the sort that's usually found in the context of household and family. And Ruth doesn't have this at the moment. She's a widow with no children. And what's interesting is that this isn't the first time that that word rest or home has popped up. So if I go back to chapter 1, verse 9 in the book, and I go back to Naomi's initial prayer for her daughter-in-laws, or her blessing, or her desire, this is how it reads. Sorry, Leangie, mine. There you go, thank you. Oh, one too far. Thanks. The Lord grant that you, that is Ruth, may find rest, each of you in the house of your husband. So it's worth noting that there's a connection of rest or home already. It's a signal to us, the reader, that when we take in what happens next in chapter 3, it's not solely the result of a really drastic Hail Mary on the part of Naomi. It's not just the result of her risky plan, but what transpires is actually God's answer to a prayer that was made some time beforehand back in chapter 1. Back in chapter 1, Naomi prayed for rest for Ruth, and lo and behold, we're going to find out that that's exactly what's happened. So God is already working here. That's what's being pointed out to us. Next in verse 2. Naomi reminds Ruth that Boaz is their near relative and kinsman redeemer. And guess what? Tonight, he's going to be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. I was only doing that last week. Now, this is worth a brief explanation as it helps to understand the rest of the scene. And I certainly didn't know what winnowing barley on the threshing floor involved until I did some research here. It's pretty interesting. I found it pretty interesting. So the barley and wheat have been harvested and now needs to be sorted between the chaff and the heavier grains of wheat. So this involved getting apparently like a big fork-like tool, and heaving loads of wheat manually, so big loads of wheat and chaff, in the air. And the lighter chaff is blown away and dispersed. So where would this happen back then? Preferably somewhere where there was a hard floor, probably like some rocks that are put down instead of dirt, because you need to sweep up all those grains where they landed, and you don't want all the grains getting mixed up with the dirt. So probably like a stone kind of flat floor. And secondly, you probably want this to be done, amazingly enough, on top of a high hill or a mountain, because in this case, the wind is going to be your friend, because you need the wind to pick up all the chaff and blow it away. So this probably also means that the threshing floor won't be a small, dimly lit room as I always imagined it. Instead, it's going to be probably on some exposed rocky outcrop. And it won't be part of an enclosed, fortified town like Bethlehem at the time either, but outside the gates. So right away, it's remote, and with that comes all the risks of being remote back in those days. Wild animals, banditos, stuff like that. And Naomi somehow knew that that's what Boaz had in his diary for that evening. And why the night, you may ask, and not the day? The nighttime breezes must have been more favourable for the winnowing compared to perhaps like some gusty daytime wind. So next, now that we've got that cleared up, next in verses 3 to 4, Naomi gives Ruth very specific and clear instructions. Wash and perfume. Put on your cloak, as per the ESV, and that's probably more accurate than the NIV's rendering of best clothes, which could be, as we'll see, a little bit misleading. So put on your cloak. Now wait until Boaz is finished eating and drinking, and then, when he's decided to lie down, go and uncover his feet and lie down. And then what, Naomi? What comes next? Oh, he'll tell you what to do. So a few things on this. Now, on the one hand, okay, because again, this is where it gets fairly complex and perhaps ambiguous, so it's worth unpacking. On the one hand, of course, Naomi was advising Ruth to make herself appear attractive to Boaz. But the degree to which that level of attractiveness becomes provocative or seductive, that can be overplayed. It's worth noting that. So, on the one hand, it's worth remembering that the need to wash regularly, so go and wash yourself, the need to wash regularly was heightened back then. There was lots of open outdoor work and lots of open footwear as well. Perfume. This is probably scented aromatic olive oil. It's a long way from Chanel No. 5. And again, maybe it was even more necessary than today for concealing body odour, because again, the kind of climate and the kind of work that people regularly undertook and lived in. And Naomi instructed Ruth to put on her cloak, not a best dress. And this word, the Hebrew word, it designates a common piece of outerwear that both men and women wore back then, which covered all but their face. Poor people slept in these garments. And Ruth was going to spend the night outdoors, where it was cold and dark. So why bother getting dressed up when no one can see you? That's like going on holiday and not putting it on social media. It's that fruitless. It's a waste of time. So that's like, I suppose, one side of the argument. On the other side of the argument, this story takes place, as we read, I think in chapter 1, in the time of the judges. And that's a slice of history that was notorious for immorality and people deciding to do what was right in their own eyes. People were desperate. These threshing floors were probably frequented by prostitutes, guys by themselves outside the township for the night. What happened in the threshing floor stays in the threshing floor, that kind of thing. And some of the language that Naomi uses here could be interpreted as being quite sexual. So uncover his feet. This could be taken and was taken simply as uncovering something, but was also frequently used to denote uncovering someone's nakedness. To lie down often meant having sexual relations. And believe it or not, feet was sometimes used as a euphemism. I don't make this stuff up. This is what some of the commentators said. So you can see that between threshing floors not infrequently being a context for illicit liaisons and Naomi's choice of words, this scenario is often seen as having sexual overtones. But again, going back to the other side, for this to be the case, it would mean a big change in how Naomi's character has been presented. So far in the text, apart from having those few initial doubts about the character of God in chapter 1, the text has portrayed her as being virtuous. Now, why would that suddenly change in chapter 3, which of course it would, by her asking her daughter-in-law to do something that is so brazenly immoral? Also, whilst Naomi instructs Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet and perhaps lower limbs, those instructions finish with, and then you lie down. So note, not lie down next to him or even lie down at his feet, but just lie down. That's all that we read in terms of her instruction. That's as far as they go. And further, Boaz so far has been presented as a righteous man, a good guy by the text up to this point. He also thinks highly of Ruth. That's already been established in chapter 2. So imagine how such a good guy would be likely to react if he was woken up by this scrupulous woman who was trying to sexually hustle him. That probably won't end well for Ruth or Naomi. And it's hard to see Naomi wanting to set Ruth up for that. Boaz certainly wouldn't praise Ruth, if that's how he read her actions, like he subsequently does, if her intentions were overtly and primarily sexual. So putting all that together, the gambit still seems to be undeniably provocative and ambiguous. Isn't this the kind of conversation perhaps they could have during daylight hours in public? Maybe not. Why did Ruth have to wait until Boaz had eaten and drunk his fill and then gone to sleep? Did Naomi want him to be groggy? I don't know. But what I am fairly certain about is that this is somewhere at least in the middle of sexual and completely innocent. That's my opinion for now. And I'm also fairly certain that it was a huge gamble. Boaz could have woken up and easily mistook Ruth for a prostitute, because that's what went on during that day, and it was dark. He could have recognised Ruth as being Ruth, but then misread her intentions and cast her away, banned her from his property, and got her hounded out of town, given his position. Neither of those scenarios were unlikely. Commentators have pointed out how strange and precarious this scenario was. It was a woman proposing to a man. It was the younger proposing to the older. It was a field worker proposing to the field owner. And it was an alien, a Moabitess, proposing to a native, a Jew. Completely topsy-turvy. And to cap it all off, the plan taps out with, and after that, just do whatever he tells you to. Not very many contingencies there. What was Naomi thinking? We can't say for sure because the text doesn't tell us explicitly, but it may be safe to conjecture that it had to do with faith. Naomi's faith in both the providence of God and also the integrity of Boaz. Her faith in God had been shaken fairly early on, but she continued regardless, and possibly bolstered by Ruth's faithfulness, the faithfulness that Ruth had offered Naomi. And Naomi's holding Boaz in high esteem, again, has been made clear in chapter 2, verse 20. She thought very highly of the guy. And lastly, in this first scene, Ruth demonstrates her ongoing faithfulness by saying, look, okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. And if you're reading this for the first time and didn't know how this panned out, I think you'd be wondering to yourself, is God going to come through here? Or maybe, is Boaz actually that much of a good guy? The whole thing is fraught. The whole thing is fraught. Which leads to scene 2, the execution. Well, thank you, Tar. It probably wasn't quite as evocative as this, but it was the best one that I could find in terms of slides. So in verse 7, we read of Ruth observing Boaz. So he eats, he drinks his fill after a hard day's work, and we read in the ESV that his heart was merry. Or, in some other translations, he was in good spirits. And again, the Hebrew, a literal rendition of the Hebrew apparently is his heart was good. His heart was good. And it's meant to describe a sense of well-being, maybe even like minor euphoria. And this probably would have been the combination of a satisfying day's and evening's work, followed by a good meal and some drink. It's important to note the text doesn't say that he was drunk. And there are plenty of examples in the Old Testament particularly where the author, they aren't backwards and coming forward saying that the protagonist is drunk, is drunk, is drunk. So the Old Testament doesn't shy away from that, from saying someone was clearly overcome by wine. So let's not read that into this scenario because the text just doesn't read that way. We read that Ruth then waits until he's asleep and then uncovers his feet, /legs, and lies down at his feet. And sometime later, he awakes, presumably to the drop in temperature, because he'll be sleeping outdoors, and is startled by the appearance of Ruth. Again, just think about the scene. It's probably dark, and so naturally, Boaz asks in his kind of groggy state, "Who are you?" And Ruth's response is just extraordinary as a complete package. She begins with, I am your servant Ruth. So a very deferential start, I'm your servant. But then turns the conversation really quite dramatically. So if you look there in verse 9, she asks Boaz to marry her. And again, let's not forget she's female, she's younger, she's effectively his employee, and she's from another culture. And on top of all of those things, she invokes his being a kinsman redeemer, which could almost be read as being a little bit presumptuous because she's not even Jewish. She's not even Jewish. And in the context of the book, that is a very much Jewish arrangement. And yet she's invoking it, which is interesting. And that wording that she uses for a marriage proposal, it may seem very strange to us. So, spread the corner of your garment over me. And the literal translation of the phrase is to spread one's wings over. To spread one's wing over. It's a beautiful phrase. And there's a wordplay on chapter 2, verse 12, in which Boaz uses wing as a metaphor for the refuge that God can provide. So there's all the connotations that come with that. Boaz, be a minor extension of God for me. Let God use you, Boaz, to provide me with some of his comfort. But there's also more to the phrase. The root word of that phrase, the Hebrew for wings, can also refer to the wings of a skirt or a garment, as well as the wings of a bird. So this phrase, spread your wing or your wings over me, could be taken literally by Boaz. Boaz, it's cold, it's like the middle of the night, I'm shivering, can you please share your blanket with me? But most importantly, the phrase, to spread your wing over, it was a euphemism for marriage. So literally a man covering a woman with his cloak could signify the start, the beginning of a new relationship. The intent of a man to provide sustenance and security for his new wife. So the phrase is just gloriously ambiguous, really. It's beautiful. And so that was Ruth, a remarkably bold entreaty. And strictly speaking, you probably noticed she's already gone off script. Naomi hasn't instructed her to be so bold, to ask Boaz to be a husband and kinsman redeemer. Instead, she stressed, just do what Boaz tells you. But Ruth went the other way completely, which is really interesting. Boaz's response is just, if not more, amazing. He addresses her here tenderly as a daughter. Not once, you'll see, but twice. His reading of her gambit in the right light is obvious. He doesn't question, chide, or reject her. Instead, he goes the other way and blesses her and notes her kindness. And notice here that he mentions her kindness twice. He says this second kindness is even greater than the first. So what was the first example of Ruth's kindness? It's mentioned again back in chapter 2, verse 11. So Boaz replied back in chapter 2, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Again, interesting. So he's praying that God looks after you, takes you under his wing, and lo and behold, he's becoming the means for that himself. So the first kindness was Ruth's sacrifices made for the sake of her mother-in-law. But what's the second one that Boaz is struck by? Now, it could be partly, as we read, that she hasn't pursued a younger husband, poor or rich. But Boaz can't be that old or decrepit yet, because he's still working alongside his workers in the field all day and threshing the grain at night by himself. And he's not exactly destitute or just getting by. He's a man of means. He's kind of rich. So there's probably some self-deprecation here. So perhaps what he's even more struck by is by Ruth asking him to be a kinsman redeemer and not just a husband. So a husband would help Ruth bear a child and would look after Ruth. But there's not the same obligation contained in just being a husband as there is a kinsman redeemer. Because a kinsman redeemer, again, means helping look after the broader family and its economic affairs. All that lay with a kinsman redeemer. And again, Boaz doesn't have to do this. He's not obligated. So Ruth and Naomi are kind of almost risking all of this on his being a good guy, a good bloke. Boaz recognises, again, Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi. That's the kindness that he's struck by. And now, in another bit of role reversal, he almost adopts the stance of a servant to Ruth. So Ruth says, I am your servant, Ruth. And now he almost takes a servant stance by saying, look, after honouring her, blessing her, I'll do whatever you ask. I'll do whatever you ask. And he effectively swears, he makes an oath that he'll deal with it and marry Ruth as well as be a kinsman redeemer if he can. And then scene 3, the next morning, both Ruth and Boaz leave undetected, again in that beautifully evocative phrase, before one could recognise the other. Because that would have been compromising if anyone had seen them, compromising perhaps both of them. And Boaz's generosity is again highlighted by the gift of grain he sends with Ruth. And we find out later on that that gift of grain was actually for Naomi, which is interesting. It's like, has Boaz already worked out who was the mastermind behind this? Or he was just kind of, he was doing the smart play and getting in good with his mother-in-law right off the bat. I don't know. Whichever way, it was smart. And lastly, we see another sign of Naomi's confidence in Boaz, and by extension, God. She says, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for surely the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. So don't try to do anything else. Don't rush. Don't try to engineer anything. Just wait, because she knew how Boaz was going to tackle this. And we'll pick up that conclusion in a couple of weeks in chapter 4. So this is both a really interesting and moving story. But beyond that, are there any good reminders, or if you like, takeaways for us today? And here are 2 suggestions. Hesed, H-E-S-E-D, a Hebrew word, a Hebrew word translated into English, Hesed, which comes up time and time again in this little book. It's used in reference to Ruth, the character. It's used in reference to God. It's used in reference to Boaz. And it's such a rich term that is very difficult to translate into English via just one word. It's most frequently translated as, it's most used in reference to covenant loyalty. So all the far-reaching implications of Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Old Testament, his loyalty to the people he made a covenant with, the Jews, the nation of Israel. And it's translated variously as mercy, kindness, loyalty, faithfulness, and often loving kindness. So again, a super rich word. And Hesed first originates from God. But Ruth, this book demonstrates our mirroring of God's Hesed in our relationships with each other in such a way that it shows or highlights his larger Hesed. Or let me try to put it in a simpler way. God's great loyalty and loving kindness towards me is made manifest in your loyalty and loving kindness towards me. Does that make more sense? Ruth's choice to display hesed towards Naomi had immediate and far-reaching consequences. It struck Boaz and led him to interpret her otherwise ambiguous actions in chapter 3 the right way. He also says that it's due to her hesed that the community regarded her as being a noble woman or a worthy woman. God incorporated Ruth and Boaz's hesed to bring about his plan of salvation as well, which we'll learn more about next time in chapter 4. And so all of this is just to say that our choices, our decisions, the crossroads that we daily reach as to whether we act in a manner that is merciful, kind, and loyal to each other, these things really matter. They may have implications that we'll never even know about, because God takes these noble choices that we make with our free will, and he can incorporate them into his grander plans. So our choosing to act in a hesed-like manner matters. I hope that's encouraging, because I think, if nothing else, it shows that our actions, our exercise of free will, it gives that dignity. It's like God takes the raw material of our choices and does extraordinary things with them, even in the everyday. That's the first thing. The second and the last thing is that this is a reminder that God works, again, in dire situations via remarkable and ambiguous, if not imperfect, circumstances. But what's even more amazing, and what Ruth really highlights, is that he's working behind the scenes so often. God is very rarely even mentioned in this book. I think he gets a bookend in chapter 1 and chapter 4. But otherwise, it's circumstantial. It's through things like natural disasters, like a famine. It's through people's faithful choices. It's through the hesed of Ruth and Boaz, and through random encounters that people happen to have. But he's still working. We may not see him, but he's still working. And that's good to remember, because our lives may be objectively hard and unpleasant. You've lost your husband, your father-in-law, your sons. You're a recently widowed stranger in a strange land. And you may be trying to throw together these dubious and suspect schemes to try to fix things. And all the while, God is still there, working and working out and preparing how he's going to demonstrate his hesed towards us. And again, this is so encouraging to me, because it shows God doesn't need perfect to work. God's not dependent on things being perfect or people being perfect in order to intervene. Things don't even need to be black and white. Like, again, this little episode is so kind of grey and to some degree murky and ambiguous, but God still uses it. He uses like this kind of questionably morally ambiguous scenario to still work out his plans and see them come to fruition. And that's lucky for us. It's lucky for someone like me, because there's no way that I am black and white, never morally ambiguous. And I imagine that I'm not alone here. So to go back to what Alistair was saying before, aspirational, yes, but perfect, no. Perfect, no. So that's, I suppose, like the tension that this little episode highlights. Our deeds, our actions, our hesed matters. So how we behave actually matters, and God uses that. But at the same time, God takes our flawed, less than perfect, less than ideal attempts, and he makes something beautiful and important out of those. That's the tension. So let's not despair. Let's glean some hope from that. And look, if you're struggling to believe in God at the moment, maybe it's even worth reflecting for a moment on those serendipitous, I suppose, scenarios in your own life. Those times that we all have when things have always miraculously come together, when something perhaps unforeseen and beautiful has emerged from a place of suffering and misery. Because could that not be God? Perhaps that's God speaking and acting behind the scenes. Could that not be him showing you some hesed? Give that some thought. Maybe don't ignore that. Remember this little story in the midst of the time of Judges, a dark time. Judges is just replete with the opposite of hesed everywhere. Unfaithfulness, disloyalty, betrayal, people doing what was right in their own eyes, people taking the easy choice. And here in the midst of this is a cause for hope and encouragement. So let's be encouraged by that. Let me pray. Father, again, we thank you for these beautiful little inspiring stories. Thank you that you know us, you know human nature, you know our complexity better than we even know ourselves. Thank you that you're not prudish. Thank you that whilst you want us to do our best, to have those aspirations, to battle with the lesser parts of ourselves in order to become the people that you want us to be, thank you that at the same time your working, your grace, your love isn't dependent upon that. So I pray you'll help us walk and live with that tension. Help us to, again, act in a kind of Hesed-like manner towards each other and the people that you place us amongst. But help us never confuse our efforts with preconditions necessary for you to love us and to intervene. We thank you that your glory, your goodness and your love exceeds our foibles. Amen.